We're really happy today to have Arturo Fernandez. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Houston. His research interests are in neural underpinnings of bilingual language processing and second language acquisition in children and adults. A variety of neuroimaging methods as well as behavioral techniques to investigate these phenomena and published in several peer-reviewed journals. He's been funded both by us at the National Institutes of Health and at the National Science Foundation. In 2014, he was awarded the Frederick Wilhelm Bessel Research Award. Spent a year with Dr. Christian Feibach at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, where he investigated the role of genetics and bilingualism on the ability to flexibly adapt to different cognitive tasks. So, Arturo, we welcome you today. Really happy that you could be here, and I'm going to turn this over to you and let you take it away.
All right. Thanks for the nice introduction, and I'm really happy to be here as well. Wherever here might be, all of us are in different years, but together, I suppose. But in any case, I am going to talk about emergentism, language control in the bilingual brain, and I really want to start with sort of the question of the bilingual advantage, because I think that in recent years that's become a quite contentious topic. And I think there's lots of evidence on both sides suggesting that this is a complex kind of thing to understand. But, you know, initially in 2012, I think that was, I want to say about 2008 was the time when I began to see more and more students coming through who really wanted to study bilingualism and cognitive control. And that has died off somewhat more recently. So you can see here two headlines from 2012, Why Bilinguals Are Smarter, right? And then this one from 2016, The Bitter Fight Over the Benefits of Bilingualism, right? So the question is, you know, what is the benefit? So Manolo Carreras, who's at the Basque Research for Brain and Language, the institute there, he's the head of that, shared these slides with me, and he's one of the people who firmly believes that there is no bilingual advantage. I'll show you why in a second. But essentially his argument is that, you know, the question is a transfer question. Does something transfer from language to other cognitive domains? And what, you know, and if we go back to the original study from 2004, the most recent study that's shown this is from the Allstock and colleagues, in which they asked participants to look at, so this is the Simon task. And the Simon task, what they have to do is they have to track the side that a shape appears. I'm sorry, they have to track the color of the shape. And so if it's red, it would be okay with maybe a right response. With its red, you might indicate with the right response. If it's green, with the left response. So the button is on the right or the left. And the whole interesting part about this is that sometimes you might have to indicate a right response, right, a right button with red, but the red item appears on the left side, so you get a conflict. You could think of it as a form of spatial stroop, perhaps. That would be one way to describe it. And so what you find in this, these are the study from 2004, published the Allstock, and what she found was that if you looked at, so these are, I have to qualify exactly what I mean by young monolinguals and bilinguals. These are people that are middle-aged, right? And the O is for older, meaning older than 65. And so when you look at this, what stands out is that there's a difference. Every group is slower, even this bilingual group here, which shows this really teeny effect, is showing slowing for the incongruent. That is when the decision, right, the shape is on the opposite side that one has to press the button. If the mapping is for color, the shape is kind of, you could think of it as a nuisance, right, but just indicates how slow don't map on. What you see is that the bilingual show smaller effect, right, than the monolingual. And this becomes really evident for the older adults. Bilingual versus the older adult monolinguals. So the argument is that the bilinguals are able to do this Simon task because, and the arguments that have been put forth in literature, that it has to do with the fact that bilinguals have to manage two languages. If we go back to this slide here, maybe some idea like this, right? That they're having to manage competing items either receptively or productively, and that leads to this advantage. And Manolo Carreras in the Basque country has basically looked at a series of populations, so children. And what I'm going to do is just kind of go through his slides quickly, and just to show you the first one is bilinguals are in green, the monolinguals are in red, and so in a verbal Stroop, a non-verbal Stroop example, right, published work now, he finds no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals in the size of this effect. So that would be the, if you want, the difference here would be what he's measuring, and he's just plotting the difference, and there's no difference between bilinguals and monolinguals in the Stroop, in an interference task with children. Again, the facilitation effect is not any different between the two groups. And this kind of shows it across age, right, that there's just no distinction between monolinguals and bilinguals. And again, a last chance to look at this effect. And again, in terms of RT, in terms of percent errors, no difference between these two groups. When we look at young adults, I believe these are the data for young adults, he again finds no difference. So, right, red for monolinguals, green for bilinguals, no difference there, no difference there. Sorry, now we're at the young adults. And so you see that, again, there's no difference. And when he looks at older adults, in the studies that they've done, his group has done over in the Basque Country, there are no differences, right? And so his argument, and he's a pretty strong proponent that there's no bilingual advantage, right? And he and I have had conversations about it. I don't feel nearly as strongly as he does, but it's pretty clear that he feels very strongly about this. And there have been others, Kenneth Papp among others, who've published several papers, arguing that there is no advantage or it's very small. There are some things that we see. For example, we do see the effect of vocabulary learning. So I'm switching here to slightly, and I think in all fairness, the argument isn't that the bilingualism isn't some form of an advantage. It's just a question if it's a non-linguistic or a cognitive advantage. I think everybody would agree that bilinguals and the way they process language is different than a monolingual. And we do see this emerging literature looking at vocabulary learning, right? So if we look at Catalan-Spanish bilinguals, work done by Cristina Sanz in 2000, they're better at learning English relative to Spanish monolinguals, and also in novel word learning. So one of the questions we had was, well, what if we did set up something like looking at novel word learning, adult monolinguals compared to bilinguals? And of course, we had to be careful because what we're going to do is we're going to look at Spanish-English bilinguals. There are lots of different names for them, so I'll define them for all the different literatures. If someone is in, we would call them early bilinguals. Some people call them early sequential bilinguals. Others call them heritage learners because they've learned Spanish as a heritage language. And they're also called English language learners. These are all names for the same group, and the group is basically a group of children who are exposed to Spanish early in life and generally learn English sometime around kindergarten or in early grade school, and then over time transition into being more and more proficient. We gave them some screening in the language history questionnaire, a Boston naming test. At that time we used that to measure the proficiency of language. We've since gone away from that because the Boston naming test has some issues with cultural sensitivity. And so, even monolinguals in Mexico score lower than monolinguals in the U.S. on the Boston naming test, which is kind of interesting, that data that we have. Just some of the items are not as common. So we've gone away from that to more standardized versions. But in this study, we used that. We had them essentially learn a bunch of words, and the words were German words, and they had about 1 to 2.5 hours to learn these words.
No, because I don't want to be sick.
We gave them flashcards with the words.
All right, the OBSSR.
We gave them flashcards with the words in English, and then their translations. Got them to 90% correct. And you might be wondering, okay, what language did we use? And that was one consideration, of course, which was if we used a language like French, well, then a Spanish-English bilingual may be, in fact, advantaged, right, because French and Spanish and English even, do share some orthographic and lexical, they have some orthographic and lexical similarity, and so the difference could actually be some kind of augmentative effect. So we actually chose German. German words in the sense that any advantage we deemed would be present would be an advantage from English, right, in learning these new words. And since the Spanish-English bilinguals spread themselves across these two languages, their proficiency would be slightly lower in English relative to the monolingual, so they would be relatively disadvantaged if we're just thinking of purely as the language is helping them learn these words. So what we did is we had a series of words. Some of them were cognates, Bruder and brother, Nacht and night. Non-cognates such as Pferd or Korb, which are horse and basket. And then we had English words. And the trick of this was we had them learn these translations, but then we asked them when they went into the scanner to make a living, non-living judgment on each item. And of course, we wanted them to do a really deep task, but there were items that people disagreed with our judgment. So for example, hair, a lot of people called that living, and technically it's not living because it's the root that's living, the hair itself is not. But, you know, we were fine with that. We weren't so worried about them being correct, just that they all agreed. And items in which there were sort of a chance, we eliminated from the analysis. What we found was that, in fact, the monolinguals and bilinguals, so these are the reaction times for the judgments to these different types of words. You see here the English words, and in other studies we've done, we generally find that monolinguals, and other studies that we've done in other labs as well, have found that monolinguals generally are faster than bilinguals. Notice that this task in particular these are not really fast reaction times for single words. If we were reading single words, we'd be in a much lower, maybe even in the 400 millisecond range, maybe to 700, maybe even faster. But we're down, you know, it's a second and a half. So this is a slow task. It takes them a long time to decide if it's living or non-living. The interesting thing is that the monolinguals and bilinguals are equivalent. Furthermore, the bilinguals are faster than the monolinguals for these newly learned German words, both for cognates and non-cognates. So that suggests that the bilinguals are faster, at least this group of bilinguals, relative to the monolinguals. And then the question is, okay, what's going on? Right? So they all showed increased activity outside of traditional languages for these newly learned words. It's not surprising that we would get other areas of activity because this is a fairly difficult task. It's not just learning the new words, but it's actually deciding what they are. Are they living or non-living, which we thought was a pretty deep, difficult task. And judging by the reaction times for a young adult, these are really slow reaction times. So indeed, it was a difficult task for them. And then we looked at the brain activity. Right? So the brain activity, when we compared monolinguals to bilinguals, and then bilinguals to monolinguals. Remember, the monolinguals are slower, and these are for German words in general, and then one small comparison just for the cognates when we compare monolinguals and bilinguals, are in areas of the anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the caudate, supplementary motor area. And these are areas generally thought to be involved in cognitive control. So the interesting thing about this is that the monolinguals are slower than the bilinguals, but they're also showing increased activity in areas involved in cognitive control when they're processing these newly learned words. When we compare the bilinguals to the monolinguals, we find an increased area of activity in the putamen, which is also thought to be involved in control, although there is a debate about is it cognitive control, is it motor control. There's some studies that have found increased activity in the putamen for articulatory type of processing. So again, it's subject to interpretation, but our view is that clearly the type of control invoked by bilinguals for these newly learned words is different than the monolinguals. And that you can't quite appreciate how big this chunk of it is, although maybe you do, but it is a big chunk of putamen and it's bilateral, right? Again, it's interesting that we get this difference. So learning new vocabulary is difficult. There's no doubt about that. and it doesn't matter what the previous language experience is. But the interesting thing is that these monolinguals and bilinguals show differences in response to these new words. No, me. Sorry. And it suggests that, again, and the interpretation might be, okay, why is it that the monolinguals are different? What what are they doing? And one interpretation we have is they may be using some form of a more explicit semantic strategy during early word learning. And the bilinguals seem to be using more motor-based control, which is sort of an interesting follow-up question is, well, what does that mean? Why are they using more motor-based control? And so that it'd be nice to follow these studies up and sort of figure out exactly what is it the bilinguals are doing and why is there this difference. And this kind of dovetail into a second set of studies looking at genetics, language history, and cognitive control. Right? And the issue of language history is one that has, no pun intended, a history. It's been studied for many, many years, the effect of essentially they're not competing, but two different factors, right? The age at which somebody learns a second language and how proficient they are in that second language. And so these two factors have been studied and they've been present in the bilingual literature, at least in terms of the bilingual brain, for, I want to say, over 100 years, since the late 1800s. Cognitive control came a little bit later in the 1920s, and that's the one that has, again, been revived across several ways of looking at switching, maybe a switching mechanism that's used for cognitive control, something of that sort, or the idea that maybe there's more interference because bilinguals have to inhibit one language to speak the other. That's been studied across at least 2 or 3 waves over the last 90 years or so. And then more recently, people have begun to be interested in genetics. The genetics part was one that was surprising at the beginning because my colleague Christian Fiebach, who's in Frankfurt now, but at the time was in Heidelberg, had done this really nice work looking at switching, like a switching task, comparing people who differ on TAC1A polymorphism, which is thought to be involved in the dopamine system subcortically, and found that those who were carriers of a certain variant, right, a certain SNP, as they call it, of the A1 plus, showed reduced switching costs, and those who didn't have this particular variant actually showed slightly increased, significantly increased, it wasn't a huge effect, but it was significant increase in cortical areas involved in cognitive control when doing a switching task. And so this led me to think about, well, what would happen if we looked at genetics and bilingualism as a possibility, right? So in a first preliminary study, we looked at genotyping of bilinguals. We wanted to see what would happen if we looked at bilinguals at the University of Houston, genotyped them for these different variants. And so I have a group here of 122 Spanish-English bilinguals, 58 English monolinguals. I wanted that number slightly higher, but being one of the most diverse universities in certainly in the U.S., not the most diverse, but the most diverse, it gets hard to find monolinguals, actually. And the other restriction we had is we wanted Caucasian monolinguals because we wanted to make sure we could replicate the proportions that have been found previously in the literature. So what you see here are groups, again, that differ on their English age of acquisition. So, of course, the monolinguals that we put not applicable. Some people will put 2 as their age of acquisition. Language acquisition, native language acquisition occurs very, very early in typically developing populations. For our Spanish-English bilinguals, some around 6 years of age. The proficiency for the monolinguals is higher in English than the bilinguals. That's, again, what we've found in the past. Proficiency in Spanish is marked here, right? We have the socioeconomic status, which also differs across our populations, with Spanish-English bilinguals having lower socioeconomic status. But the interesting thing that kind of stood out to us was, well, look at the proportion of those with A1+. And I think it becomes more evident when we do it as a figure. is that the monolinguals are showing what is typically been observed in the literature. About a third of the people have A1+, they're carriers. And again, these effects are restricted to a switching task. They're significant effects, but they're not huge effects. But it's interesting that we get this difference in this gene, and there are many other reasons this could happen besides it having to do with some switching. At least we in a paper, thought about it and discussed it, suggested, well, one possibility is an ethnicity difference. We know that the distribution of genes varies across ethnicity. We don't have a lot of background studies to look at that. So it's possible that that could be an effect, right? The other possibility is that, in fact, it has something to do with possibly the bilinguals who make it, right, to the University of Houston are different than the monolinguals who make it. And this might be one, not the only one, but one gene that confers some advantage to this group. And we would have to follow up by looking at students that are in high school or, others that don't go to college, to see whether in the general population that proportion in the Hispanic bilingual population looks more like this. But it's interesting nonetheless, right? So what about language experience? So we have this data that we've collected now with bilinguals, looking at genetics, so with the DRD2 gene, looking at nonverbal task switching, looking at a nonverbal inhibition task, which I'll describe in a second, and then English second language production. And Kelly Vaughn, who was the head of this study and who wrote it up, a graduate student in my lab, she set up this figure to sort of describe the relationship between these things, and I'll walk through those now. Right? So, sorry, I can do them from here. So the nonverbal task was an action-object switching task. Right? So in that task, what people have to do is they have to, essentially they're given a symbol at the beginning of a task, and they're told to track the color, for example. Yeah, in this case it's a shape color task. So they have to track the color of a figure that's presented on the screen, one after the other. And they're told track the color. And so they do that for a while. And then they're given another symbol which asks them or tells them either to continue tracking the color or to switch. And so that's a switching task, although it's not a switching task on every stimulus, it's a switching task over time. So we call this a nonverbal test, a switching task. And in fact, it is, from what we can observe, not related to language background. The size of that switching, how long it takes them to switch is not related to anything that has to do with language background. Our nonverbal inhibition task is the Simon task, which has been used again by people in the literature to look at the difference in bilinguals, between bilinguals and monolinguals. We chose it to look at, to what extent it might be influenced by, what brain activity would be associated with it, and then how it might be influenced by either the genetic characteristics of people or their language background. And we found a relationship between nonverbal inhibition and language background. And then finally, the English L2 production is just picture naming inside the scanner, where we ask people to, in their head, actually out loud, produce the name of the picture. And so what we get is this very complex relationship between language background. Right? So what the age of acquisition of a language and their language proficiency is related to English L2 production, which is when people are using this task, we find that moderates, right, activity in the inferior frontal gyrus. Language background also relates to the Simon task and the effect there, the size of the Simon effect, and activity anterior cingulate cortex. And nonverbal task switching relates to activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, and that actually is related to the carrier status. So it seems that genes are sort of tracing out one aspect of this cortical or cognitive control cortical circuit, whereas language background independently influencing other parts of it. And so this was just done to show the sort of the complexity of language background, genetics, and the tasks we use. And so going forward, our idea is to continue looking at this complexity to see what determines the nature of control, and to sort of give you my position on the whole bilingual advantage idea is, I mean, the question is, it's clear that lots of things affect cognitive control. Bilingualism may be one of them. And then the question is, okay, can we start to figure out which aspects of bilingualism may be influencing cognitive control, and what other factors may also be influencing cognitive control? So this is a beginning at looking at those types of studies. The other thing I did want to talk about, which is interesting, and this is work that we've done with children. So we've been looking at the nature of bilingual children. This is structural data. Looking at the thickness, right, of the left hemisphere and the frontal middle gyrus, right, for balanced and unbalanced children relative to monolinguals. And what we find, which is interesting, so this is a group of children that are, they're again, like I said earlier, they're sequential bilingual, so they've learned Spanish first, and they're now children in school, right, learning English. And the interesting thing is that we get this difference in the middle frontal gyrus, which is thought to be a control area. And initially the way we started these studies was to actually look at listening to single, actually nonsense syllables. So it was an idea to look at phonology. And what we began to observe was lots of use of control in tasks that involve phonology, nonsense, soft, soft. So they weren't lexical, they weren't word tasks. And this is the structural data from these children showing that those children who show balanced and unbalanced proficiency have differences in the thickness, and it appears that the unbalanced group looks more like the monolingual group in terms of that thickness than the balanced group. Now there could be lots of reasons for this. It could be experience, it could be, it also turns out that balanced and unbalanced, interestingly, also goes along with rated accent in English. So the suggestion is that, is it experience that's making it, experience that's driving children to be more balanced, and hence their brain is changing, or are their brains slightly different or able to adapt to a second language more easily, and that's reflected in them becoming more balanced than unbalanced? That's sort of an open question. We don't really know. We can't address that with these data, but it's interesting that we're finding this difference in children, child bilinguals. We also find a difference, and you might remember sometime back here, I talked about the putamen and bilinguals showing more activity in the putamen when they were processing these newly learned German words compared to monolingual. And the putamen popped back up for us, actually popped up a couple of times, and in the literature as well, when we looked at the balanced and unbalanced these are just the bilinguals, right? And just if we look at the difference between first and second language proficiency, right, the putamen shows the difference in its cortical structure when we compare balanced to unbalanced. And the argument about what the putamen does is that it's involved in, not that it does, but what it's involved in is in articulatory or motor types of processing. So that suggests that in terms of the structure, the children that are balanced and unbalanced may be showing a difference already at a young age. So that's an interesting further thing that we could investigate. And so, I wanted to kind of end with this idea of, why are bilinguals different? I didn't want to quite overwhelm people with lots of data, and I wanted to give time for people to ask questions. But, we're sort of with this question of, does bilingualism train the brain? Is it the case that, there is some effect on cognitive control from the fact that bilinguals use two languages, and what would they be? And one aspect that we've begun to look at is actually thinking about this in terms of the type of task. So if you recall, the task that I presented with learning new words in German was a vocabulary learning task. But it turns out that several people have started to look at the learning of new rules. So you would, for example, be given two stimuli and asked to do some set of operations on them, so two numbers. And they found, Andrea Stocco and Chantal Prada run a series of studies where they've actually looked at bilinguals having to do a new task. So they're trained on certain tasks, and then they practice those, and when they get in the scanner, they're actually told to do something different with two numbers. So it might be something like add them, and then divide by 2, and then they get into the scanner and they do something like subtract them and multiply by 2. And so what happens is that it turns out the bilinguals they're different, they're better at these tasks, and they show differential brain activity in subcortical regions involved in cognitive control. So one additional hypothesis we're entertaining is, and Andrea Stocco and Chantal Prada and I have been talking about this, is how can we extend this idea of, the novel learning as a possible way to think about it. And Andrea Stocco has a series of really nice models that come out of really a different literature, the literature looking at essentially from computational neuroscience models of the basal ganglia and what it handles. And so in that literature, what's happened is they've talked about learning of new rules, and the idea we're sort of pursuing is, well, we could think of bilingualism as learning of new rules or different rules in some ways, or having to learn two different rules at the very least. And there is some data suggesting, or some theoretical work suggesting, that very early in development, the basal ganglia may be involved in having to deal with competing sound systems. And so maybe that's one source of a possible bilingual advantage. And so we want to look at this learning of new rules as a possible way to explore that further. And in the future, hopefully do more computationally based types of models. Andrea Stocco is the one who does the computationally based models. So, it's not my area. I'm more of an experimentalist, but it would be nice to start to think about it. One thing he did tell me in a conversation was that in his models, when he does these computational models, they don't really think about language. Now, obviously, we do as humans, but the models don't really seem to have a code. You almost have to tell the model that these are different languages, because in some of his models, it's surprisingly, it's not evident to the model that these are two different languages. So that's an interesting aside from that. But the point is, again, trying to really understand what it is, what does bilingualism bring, what kinds of experiences happen because of bilingualism, how might that lead to a difference in the brain. And then I think once we develop that, we can perhaps think about how that relates to a bilingual advantage. So there are a couple of steps here that we need to get through. There's always the question of, a sampling difference. Are monolinguals different than bilinguals on some other dimension? So if I show you, my data, obviously, possibly genetics, but there's also socioeconomic status. So, again, we can, and I think that's why in Manolo Carreras's studies in the Basque country, right, he compared Spanish bilinguals to Spanish monolinguals, obviously, in other parts of Spain, and matched for all these things. And so I think his view is that there's no bilingual advantage, right, that it's something else. Is it SES? Is it culture? Is it, could it be genetics? I mean, that's an open question. But we know that things affect control, and so one fallback is, well, what things affect control, and how big is the bilingual effect, if it exists, right? And then finally, of course, there's individual variability. And what we've been thinking about is not just individual variability at the language history level, but also individual variability now thinking about DRD2 that I presented some data on today, but also other genes, right? So COMT is another gene that's involved in cognitive control. And of course, we could also think about, going beyond the cognitive control domain to other domains, right? Phonological processing, language processing. There's more and more interest now, even in looking at the genetics of second language acquisition. But of course, these studies require a lot of power. You need large sample sizes for some of these genetic effects. They're not huge, and so you either need to really control your studies really well, or you need to expand the size of your population, the number of subjects you have, to see the effects. So I think that there's a lot to do, and it's a very exciting time, but at times it's also a bit overwhelming in terms of how to make sense of all these different factors that are playing a role in a very intricate and interesting way. And then I just wanted to just thank those that helped out. Of course, as mentioned earlier, there's the NIH, the funding that we've received, but also lots of, and Alexander von Humboldt. It was very nice that I could spend a year in Kristen Fivak's lab learning more about control and actually being in a lab that didn't do language at all, and definitely no bilingualism. A little bit of language, but definitely no bilingualism. And then various people that have helped out in the research, graduate students, collaborators, and I also, to those actually founders in the neuropsychology literature many years ago that thought about what factors might affect the bilingual brain. Thank you. So I guess it's open to questions.
I'll unmute everybody so you can hear me. Hear me? That's probably a lot of other. So everyone, unmute everyone so that I could for Arturo in terms of asking questions. That would be. Everyone could mute, that would be wonderful.
Are we allowed to ask a question by phone, or should we type it?
We have, if you type it in the chat and if everybody would mute, that would be great. Since we had to unmute everyone in order to be able, for me to be able to speak, so we could check those. Arturo, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, perfect. So we already have a couple that have come in. One is that for advocates of the value of studying and mastering a second language, do you think they are exaggerating their claiming a cognitive benefit to a broader audience outside the research community?
So I guess my question would be, who's they? Is it the press? Is it the researchers? I don't hear anything. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Unmute all.
I was
now.
the one who asked the question, and I clarified it in the chat feature.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was referring to the advocate.
Yeah.
So researchers.
Advocate.
Yes, what about them? She's just clarifying this thing. Arturo, can you hear that and answer?
No, I didn't hear. I heard advocates, but I'm not sure if she means researchers. She means,
so this is. So Allison Reed is asking about the advocates and the value of studying and mastering a second language. Do you think they're exaggerating their claim about the cognitive benefits?
Okay, so I'll just interpret by advocates. So, I mean, I don't know that I don't know if exaggeration would be the right word. I think that certainly there might have been a misrepresentation of how big the effect was, distant it was, but I don't know that it's been exaggerated. And the other thing I think that we have to be careful about is, it's hard to differentiate now between what's said in the media and what's printed, in articles. So certainly the media, I think there was a period there where there was, and I certainly felt it, where a lot of people felt that, the bilingual advantage, became a really hot topic, and everybody was talking about it, and there was a buzz around that idea. That's true. Again, was it exaggerated in the published literature? My sense is the data were there, they were presented, but I don't have the sense that they were exaggerated. I think it's when it became partly taken on by the media and by very eager students, right? Some of whom I spoke, I presented last year in Germany, and one of the students said that she came to graduate school all excited about this idea and found nothing, right? So I don't know that that it was the proponents themselves that exaggerated, or rather that it took on a life of its own. But certainly, there's a lot of questions about exactly what it is. So that's where I'll leave it at. Was it exaggerated? It was a very hot topic. Let's put it that way, and it garnered a lot of interest. It became much more complicated when we actually sat on the science, which is
Roughly, yeah.
Arturo, again, the next question is, those of you on the phone, if you would mute, that would be great, because we can't talk without you being muted. Arturo, I think a good question is about language and culture. Can language be confounded by culture, and how have biologists been a part of research on bilingualism? Have the experiences of bilingualism play a role on the effects of bilingualism?
Cut out there for a second. Can you repeat the question?
So there's a question about language and culture. Can language be confounded by culture? Let me just stop there and let you answer from there.
Language and culture, and language and?
Unfortunately, we're not getting everybody to mute at our end, and we can't talk to you unless we unmute everyone. So let me try that one more time. Can language be confounded by culture? How has bicultural identity been a part of research on bilingualism?
Yeah, there are. It's sort of, and I think it might be one of the factors that, and on the one hand, really hard to operationalize exactly what culture is, right? At least at sort of from a more biological point of view. But I think it would be not too intelligent to say that they're not somehow related strongly, in that culture in some way is a prime or a collection of things that fit in with certain linguistic labels that are associated with the language. So I would say yes. I'd say it's out of my area of research, and might be one of those things we could do in the future. But yeah, I think it is definitely, but a very tricky one to do for an experiment.
Right. But Arturo, since we're having difficulty hearing at our end, we're sending you the questions via the chat room. So you should have one up on your chat on your screen.
So I'm still sharing. So hold on. So I'm sharing my screen. Should I stop sharing?
It doesn't matter whether you stop sharing or not. If you go to chat up at the top right, you should be able to.
Just have to get back to WebEx.
Yeah. We're also just sending it to you via email.
Okay, hold on. So I have a full screen view, but there I won't see it, right? Oh, there we go, chat. Got it. Okay. All right. So here's the question. We are studying traumatic brain injury in military, both English only and Spanish native and English speaking. We're concerned about testing for traumatic brain injury using English cognitive testing in native Spanish speakers, though they also speak English. Do you have an opinion on this matter? Okay, so you're studying, so it's traumatic brain injury, both in English only and Spanish native and English speaking, using English cognitive testing in native Spanish speakers, so they also speak English. Yeah, I would think that that certainly your concern is well warranted. So yeah, definitely I would look to test them in both languages. Obviously, you must be also using nonverbal tests. So I think in that sense, it would make sense to look at both languages for sure, especially because people can vary a lot in language. And of course, we don't know, I mean, the relationship between, so let's just give a hypothetical, right? So it could be that someone speaks English quite well, right, but it's not their dominant language. And so when they suffer traumatic brain injury, because English requires them to use more cognitive control because it's a less proficient language, and that's an idea that's been studied a lot by various researchers in the field, then what might happen is that English would actually show a bigger decrement, right, than Spanish, right? So that's one possibility of not allow you to see it. So I would definitely think that you'd have to look at both languages. Let's see, I'm just trying to make sure I haven't missed any questions. Okay. Okay, got it. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, so I'm just going to start from the bottom. Is there better cognitive reserve in bilinguals? Okay, so that's a very interesting question. I don't know. You know, I actually honestly cannot tell you the answer to that question. There are data that support that point of view. There are other data that don't. There are other data with I'm thinking about the older adult literature that don't show cognitive reserve. And there's a whole tricky, very difficult question to figure out, you know, so I'll give you an example, right? So many years ago we did aging work with bilingual young and older adult bilinguals. So young meaning college age, older adult bilinguals. And one of the criticisms of the study was that we hadn't matched our older adult bilinguals with our young adult bilinguals. And that's because our older adult bilinguals had finished high school. And so what I wrote back in the response to the reviewer was, well, the problem is that these are Spanish English bilinguals that are in their 70s. This was in the 90s, that probably had schooling, right, most likely before the civil rights movement. And so how do we know that high school for them is not actually quite a very high level of education relative to bilinguals in the 90s, where they were much more likely to have high school, and then college would be seen as a higher one. So I think there's always the issue of sampling and matching that is tricky with bilinguals. So I can tell you personally, everything that I read about, having to mentally juggle two languages, the effect of, I spent a year immersed in German, and the effects that it had on my English, which Judy Kroll studied very nicely, looking at the effect of the second language on the first, in this case, the effect of the fourth language on the other three. There is clearly some kind of training effect. It makes a difference in how we process. The question I always ask myself, am I different somehow already than someone who speaks one language or two languages because I speak four? So, again, that's always a tricky question, but I want to believe that there is a cognitive reserve and that bilingualism has some advantage and does train the brain. The question is still sort of open about how exactly it does that. Hopefully I answered your question. But I don't really know. I wish I could give you a more definitive answer there. So there's another question. Okay, so you're welcome. There was a question about reading right to left versus left to right. And I'm sure there's data on that, but I'm not a literacy person, so I'm going to defer on that question. What would it be the harm in removing Spaniards from the Hispanic category and limiting Hispanic to those whose lineage are from Latin America? And I guess, I don't know, I mean, the harm in terms of comparing, I think we do always have to be very careful about where, and certainly in terms of the genetic studies, we know that people who originate from Mexico and Central America tend to be about a 50-50 European versus indigenous ancestry, Native American ancestry. And those from Spain would be different. right? And those from Argentina would be different. So I think that we do have to be careful about the origin of our populations and what inferences we want to make, and we should be careful to really know what our population is and know it well. We have a traumatic brain injury question. Moving Spaniards. Balance. Somebody had a question about balanced and unbalanced. So these were children whose, so there were some children who were better in Spanish than English, in terms of their proficiency was better in Spanish than English, and those who were equal in Spanish and English, and that was a difference. Balanced were equal in Spanish and English. Unbalanced was better in Spanish than English. And so we take that as possibly indicating that they're struggling to learn English more rapidly. And we saw differences in the middle frontal gyrus and the putamen for that group. Okay. I think I'm caught up with questions. Oh, there was one about so one question was about the differences of being able to survive in cognitive abilities between monolinguals and bilinguals. And we haven't actually done monolingual bilingual comparison. So when we did our aging work, we actually looked only at, so you said you, do you see? I'll interpret it more generally, but in terms of our work specifically, we only looked at young bilinguals, college age, and older adults, not at monolingual older adults versus bilingual older adults. There is data suggesting that there are differences in cognitive control, but there are also data when we look at, for example, Manolo Carrera's stuff with older adults, that there are not differences in certain groups. One of the hypotheses we have that we're pursuing is possibly looking at this new rule learning idea as one possibility, and in the models that are developed, computational neuroscience models, so looking at things like the Stroop task or the Simon task, or the Stroop task, the flanker task, is that they seem to, in these computational neuroscience models, involve less complex cognitive control circuits when they're modeled, and the ones that require more complex cognitive control circuits, those are associated with things like learning new rules. So, and there's also things like, almost like reinforcement type learning, where some people seem to learn in different ways. And so there's that question of, are there higher order types of cognitive control? And one way we're going to approach that is by looking at learning of new rules as a possible distinguisher between monolinguals and bilinguals. But, we're just at the beginning of that work.
Great. Arturo, I'm going to open the line back up so I can talk, though that always produces a bit of a Tower of Babel. I want to thank you for taking the time today to present, and for all the questions and all the people who are on. We had 179 registrants, so it was a nice group. I'll let everyone know that the recording of this will be available in about a month. And I also want to thank Bill Elwood for coordinating this and all of the rest of our directors' seminars, webinars over the course of the year. Our next presentation will be February the 21st. It'll be Sarah Mormon, who was one of our early stage investigator paper awardees last year, and she'll be presenting on February the 21st. And with that, I want to thank all of you for participating today. Arturo, thank you again.